President Reagan has declared a week of mourning for the 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, who lost their lives on their way into space this morning.
Tuesday morning, January 28, 1986. Millions of Americans had their eyes fixed on their televisions, waiting to witness one of the most inspiring moments in space history. For the first time, an ordinary schoolteacher was about to travel into space, and school children across the country were watching live from their classrooms. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger broke apart in front of the entire world. 7 astronauts, including that school teacher, were gone. But was it really just a tragic accident? Or was there something deeply wrong behind it? Today, we'll look at the key things that led to the Challenger disaster, the warning signs NASA ignored, and a chain of decisions that made this catastrophe inevitable. And once you know what really happened, you'll never see that day the same way again. Let's dive in. The night before. On the evening of January 27, 1986, while most Americans were finishing dinner and getting ready for bed, a very different night was beginning behind closed doors. A small group of engineers was trying to stop a launch they believed could end in disaster. And the reason was the extreme cold. By morning, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center was expected to fall to just 18 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 8 degrees Celsius, the coldest conditions ever for a space shuttle launch. Water pipes at Launch Pad 39B burst, and NASA had to keep emergency showers running through the night to stop them from freezing solid. Huge icicles formed around the launch pad, some several feet long, making the shuttle look more like an ice castle than a spacecraft preparing for flight. But the ice wasn't what frightened the engineers the most. Their biggest fear was hidden inside the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, 2 giant rockets that provided nearly 80% of the thrust needed to lift Challenger off the ground. Built by Morton Thiokol in Utah, each booster was made from 4 massive sections stacked together. Thin rubber seals called O-rings were the only thing standing between the crew and gases hotter than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Normally, these rubber rings quickly expand to seal tiny gaps as the rocket comes under pressure, almost like a squeezed rubber ball bouncing back into shape. But in extreme cold, rubber becomes hard and loses that flexibility. If the O-rings didn't seal those gaps fast enough, superheated gas could leak through. There would be no second chance. Engineers, including Roger Boisjoli, Bob Ebeling, Arnie Thompson, and Brian Russell, had been collecting evidence, damaged O-rings from earlier missions, and reports showing the problem getting worse. After the previous cold weather launch, STS-51C, the recovered booster showed severe O-ring damage at 53 degrees, far warmer than the temperature expected for the launch of Challenger. Boisjoli had even warned of a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. An emergency teleconference began. After presenting every piece of evidence they had, the engineers made one clear recommendation: do not launch. NASA had just received the strongest warning it would ever get. Yet, only hours later, everything changed. The fatal decision. So, if the danger was so clear, why did the launch move forward anyway? The answer had very little to do with engineering. By 1986, NASA was under pressure from every direction. It had promised Congress that its shuttle program would become a kind of space truck, launching 24 missions a year and making spaceflight almost routine. Launches were slipping behind schedule, costs were climbing, and commercial customers were beginning to look elsewhere. Arianespace was already winning satellite launch contracts that NASA had expected to keep. Every delay meant lost money. Then there was another clock ticking. On the evening of January 28th, just hours after Challenger was supposed to reach orbit, Ronald Reagan was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address. Plans had already been made for him, to speak live with Krista McAuliffe while she floated in space. After more than 11,000 applicants, McAuliffe had been chosen because she wasn't a military test pilot. She was an ordinary high school teacher from New Hampshire, and that made her the perfect face of NASA's new message. Space was now for everyone. Thousands of schools had arranged special satellite broadcasts. Millions of children were waiting to watch their teacher reach space. Another delay felt almost unthinkable. The emergency meeting took a darker turn. The engineers had told NASA one thing: do not launch. But instead of accepting that warning, NASA pushed back hard. Morton Theokohl then asked for a private discussion, away from NASA's ears. The engineers pleaded with their managers not to change their position. They believed the crew's lives were at risk. Jerry Mason, Morton Theokohl's senior vice president, looked at engineering chief Robert Lund. "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Stop thinking like an engineer and start thinking like a company executive." NASA's booster manager, Lawrence Malloy, changed the argument completely. "Can you prove this launch is safe?" he asked. "Can you prove the shuttle will fail?" That may sound like a small difference, but it changed everything. The engineers had months of data showing that the O-rings became dangerous in cold weather. They even had evidence from a previous launch at 53 degrees. But Challenger was about to launch at 18 degrees, something that had never been tested before. Because they couldn't mathematically prove exactly what would happen at that temperature, there wasn't enough evidence to cancel the launch. No new tests were carried out. The risk was exactly what it had been an hour earlier. The launch was approved. Whether the engineers had been wrong, or whether history was about to prove them right. 73 seconds. The morning of January 28, 1986, looked nothing like a normal launch day. The launch pad was covered in ice. Engineers from Rockwell International, the company that built Challenger, worried that pieces of ice could break off during liftoff and hit the shuttle. They believed that it could damage the protective tiles of the spacecraft. They refused to approve the launch. But NASA decided the ice wasn't dangerous enough to stop the mission. Inside the crew cabin, however, the mood was hopeful. The astronauts were finally ready to fly. Commander Dick Scobie calmly guided the crew through the final checks, while pilot Mike Smith even joked about the freezing weather. None of them knew that the real danger was hidden where no one could see it. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. Less than 1 second later, tiny black puffs of smoke escaped from the right solid rocket booster. The freezing O-rings had failed to seal properly, exactly as the engineers had feared. Something unexpected happened. Melted insulation and aluminum residue from the burning fuel temporarily plugged the gap, almost like a cork sealing a leaking bottle. For nearly a minute, Challenger kept climbing, as if nothing was wrong. At 56 seconds, everything changed. The shuttle was struck by the strongest high-altitude wind shear ever experienced during a shuttle flight. The violent shaking broke that fragile seal apart. 2 seconds later, a jet of flame burst from the side of the booster. It burned directly into the enormous external fuel tank carrying liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. The support holding the booster failed. The booster slammed into the tank, tearing it open. At 73 seconds, television viewers saw what looked like a massive explosion. But it wasn't an explosion in the way most people imagine. The fuel tanks ruptured, releasing huge amounts of hydrogen and oxygen that ignited in the open air. The orbiter itself never exploded. It was torn apart by enormous aerodynamic forces at nearly twice the speed of sound. Only one part remained largely intact: the crew cabin. And what happened inside that cabin would become one of the most heartbreaking parts of the entire Challenger story. The tragedy no one saw. To the millions watching live, it looked like everything ended in an instant. After separating from the rest of the shuttle, the crew cabin kept moving upward. Carried by its own momentum, it climbed to nearly 65,000 feet before gravity finally pulled it back down. Then came a silent fall that lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. There were no engines. When investigators later recovered the cabin, they found something unexpected. It hadn't exploded or broken apart in the sky. Even its thick windows had survived the fall, only breaking when the cabin slammed into the Atlantic Ocean. Then came the discoveries that raised even more painful questions. The last voice, captured before contact was lost, is believed to have been pilot Mike Smith, calmly saying, "Uh-oh," but enough to suggest the crew knew something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators also recovered personal egress air packs, small emergency air supplies carried by the astronauts. At least 3 had been switched on by hand. NASA later measured the air left inside those packs, and the amount matched almost exactly what someone would have used during the cabin's 2-minute and 45-second fall. Several protected switches on Mike Smith's control panel had been moved from their normal positions. Those switches couldn't flip by accident during the breakup. Someone had reached for them, trying to restore electrical power and regain control of a spacecraft that was no longer responding. None of this proves exactly how aware the crew remained during those final moments. The evidence points to one heartbreaking possibility. The astronauts may have survived the initial breakup. When the cabin finally struck the Atlantic Ocean at around 200 miles per hour, the force was far beyond anything the human body could survive. For 73 days, Navy divers searched the ocean floor before finally recovering the crew compartment. NASA's early public statements left many people believing the crew had died instantly. Only months later did investigators reveal evidence suggesting the reality may have been far more tragic. And once the full story began to emerge, people started asking the most important and perhaps the most frightening question: who allowed this to happen in the first place? The blame game. The explosion was over, but the fight over why it happened was only beginning. President Ronald Reagan created an independent investigation known as the Rogers Commission. It brought together some of the country's most respected minds, including astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, along with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. NASA insisted the disaster was an extremely complex technical failure. Feynman wasn't convinced. During one televised hearing, he performed an experiment that lasted less than a minute. He placed a small piece of the same rubber used in the shuttle's O-rings into a glass of ice water. After a few minutes, he took it out and released the clamp holding it shut. It didn't spring back the way it was supposed to. Feynman showed millions of people what pages of technical reports had hidden. Cold made the rubber lose its flexibility. The danger wasn't mysterious. It was visible to anyone watching. Investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. NASA had officially classified the O-rings as a Criticality 1 component. If they failed, there was no backup. The shuttle and everyone inside would almost certainly be lost. Yet previous missions had already shown serious O-ring damage, especially the STS-51C mission in 1985. Instead of stopping flights until the problem was fixed, managers approved launch after launch, believing the secondary O-ring would always protect them, that investigators later described as normalization of deviance. The warning signs slowly became accepted. Another truth began coming out. Alan MacDonald, who had refused to sign the launch approval, and engineer Roger Boisjoli told investigators about the heated meeting the night before launch. They described the ignored warnings, the pressure from management, and the decision that had changed everything. NASA's handling of the investigation also raised difficult questions. The agency tightly controlled internal documents and public communication in the early weeks after the disaster. There was no evidence that NASA expected Challenger to explode. The real tragedy was something far more ordinary and far more dangerous. Good people had convinced themselves that an unacceptable risk was acceptable, but the people who exposed it had to face consequences no one warned them about. The price of truth. The Challenger story ended when the investigation was over. But for the engineers who had tried to stop it, it was only the beginning. Bob Ebeling never stopped blaming himself. The night before the launch, he went home, looked at his wife, and said, "The Challenger is going to blow up, and everyone on it is going to die." In 2016, at the age of 89, Ebeling broke down during an interview, saying he still cried over Challenger and even questioned why God had chosen him for that job. His words touched people across the country. Former NASA employees and complete strangers wrote to him. It wasn't his fault. Just weeks later, he passed away, finally having found some peace. After testifying before the Rogers Commission and revealing what had happened behind closed doors, he became an outsider inside his own company. Important projects disappeared. Colleagues stopped supporting him. He left the aerospace industry altogether. Instead of building rockets, Guascioli spent the rest of his life teaching engineering ethics. He traveled to universities around the world, reminding future engineers that protecting human lives must always come before protecting a company. Alan McDonald faced punishment too. After refusing to sign the launch recommendation and speaking honestly during the investigation, he was pushed into a dead-end position. But when the Rogers Commission learned what had happened, public pressure forced Morton Thiokol to reverse course. McDonald returned, not to hide the mistake, but to fix it. He led the redesign of the solid rocket booster joints, helping eliminate the very flaw that had destroyed Challenger. Their stories changed engineering forever. The Challenger disaster isn't remembered only as a failure of technology. It's taught around the world as a lesson in courage and in what can happen when experts are ignored. But Challenger's story didn't end with those lessons alone. What Challenger changed forever. More than 36 years after Challenger broke apart, the story took one final, unexpected turn. In 2022, a documentary crew exploring the Atlantic Ocean wasn't searching for the space shuttle at all. They were looking for the wreckage of a World War II rescue aircraft that had disappeared decades earlier. Half buried beneath the sand was a massive piece of debris covered with the black heat-resistant tiles used on NASA's space shuttles. NASA later confirmed it was one of the largest Challenger fragments discovered in more than 25 years. The agency decided to leave it exactly where it was, resting on the ocean floor as a memorial to the 7 astronauts who never came home. But Challenger's true legacy wasn't that piece of wreckage. It was the changes that the disaster forced NASA to make. The solid rocket boosters were completely redesigned. Engineers added extra backup seals, made the joints much stronger. NASA also created an independent safety office with the power to stop a launch if serious safety concerns were raised. NASA stopped treating space missions like routine flights. Launch schedules became much more careful, and astronauts began wearing improved escape suits and safety equipment to give them a better chance in an emergency. Its story isn't just about rockets or NASA. It's about what can happen when meeting a deadline becomes more important than listening to the evidence, when protecting an organization's image matters more than protecting people's lives, and when experts are asked to prove something is dangerous, instead of leaders first proving that it's truly safe. In the end, Challenger wasn't destroyed by one failed rubber seal. It was destroyed by a chain of decisions. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. What do you think was the biggest mistake that led to the Challenger disaster? And if you or someone in your family witnessed those heartbreaking moments live, what was that experience like? We'd love to hear your memories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want more incredible mysteries, discoveries, and true stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.